glad to be here with you all this morning. Heather, perhaps what we should explain what CSAR stands for.
Yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
CSAR is Climate Change Strategies for Archaeological Resources. This committee began as an SAA task force, I think before 2016, and then it was sort of morphed into or approved as an official committee. Tom
McGovern.
McGovern was really instrumental in making that happen. So
Yeah.
he was the first chair of that committee. Ann Jensen was the chair after him, and then we've taken on as the third set of co-chairs for that committee.
All right. So we're very excited to be able to present to you all today, to talk with you all today, because it's a big day for our committee. We will be going into this in some detail toward the end, but the Society for American Archaeology is releasing our formal statement on climate change and cultural heritage today. And it's going out to news outlets, and who knows where it will end up, but we're going to be sharing that with you as well. So we just are very glad to have that opportunity today. All right. So Heather, you're going to get started, I think.
Mm-hmm. Oops. So let's see, I'm not moving myself. Okay, all right. So we're presenting today sort of a synopsis of an expansion also of the session that we organized for the Society for American Archaeology meeting in Chicago, which is focused on the need for us to take on the role as storytellers, or what we're calling science telling, in our sort of quest to bring to light some of the issues that archaeologists, we all, are facing in our sort of day-to-day work lives. So, as we point out here, we have spent many years, I think, kind of blowing the horn, sort of setting off the alarm, or as Tom McGovern says, pointing out that our libraries are burning in terms of what's happening with archaeological resources across the world, really. And I think that we're really sort of emphasizing a need to, in order to continue to engage with various publics, to sort of shift our tone a little bit, and take on this more like narrative style. As we point out here in the slide, that we've gotten pretty lost in the data and really sort of pointing out all the fears and the horrors of what cultural resources are facing, and we're concerned that people are going to be turning a deaf ear, that they're tired, they're beaten down, they want something else. And so we're going to talk today a little bit about some ideas that we and all of our colleagues, many of you are here today, have been putting together in terms of like different ways that we can creatively engage with communities while still adhering to the sort of like the rigor that we're accustomed to in terms of the work that we do in our day-to-day work lives. And see if I can forward this. There we go. All right. So collectively, within the discipline, many of us see that there are tons of different types of physical threats that cultural heritage resources are facing due to climate change. Sea level rise and storm surge, the things that are going on along the coast, have had a high degree of attention, relatively speaking. But, as many of our colleagues are well aware, these types of threats occur in the interior. These are not just, limited to the coast. And so these include just things like extreme rainfall events, flooding, erosion along the coastline, but also along, major rivers, riverways, mass wasting, drought, the effects of drought, wildfires that we're well aware of going on along the interior and along the West Coast. And then, as one of our colleagues also pointed out, the effects of the melting of permafrost and ice patches in the high altitude regions. Okay, so, but more than just the physical threats, what we're also seeing, and Carol's pointed this out in terms of, she's seeing our role now sort of like as first responders almost in terms of what the other effects are of the loss of these heritage resources to communities. So overall, just widespread, anxiety that, hyped up anxiety, threats to overall well-being from that, um, the loss of place and the connection to those places also, the loss of these really milestone kind of touchstone places that are really important to our overall collective identities, but also not just our widespread collective identities, but communities that have specific identities that are linked to place, and the effects are really tremendous there as well. And as we see, the effects, the physical effects are really borne unevenly by various communities. And so marginalized communities are seeing these effects at a much greater rate and are continued to be marginalized, and the attention that's paid to the loss of their heritage resources and their sense of, community and their sense of place.
So I'm going to pick up here, and I'm going to encourage you all, if you're not familiar with Katharine Hayhoe, she was at Texas Tech for a number of years. She's a climate scientist, and she's now the senior climate scientist for the Nature Conservancy. And she has this incredible podcast called Global Weirding. And she's a very interesting character because she identifies herself as an evangelical Christian and a climate scientist, and her whole career has, in the last few years, has been built on this question of how do you communicate climate science? How do you communicate climate change? How do you get people to understand the magnitude of change and what is coming? And her approach to this is very simple. You can't stop talking about it. You've got to keep talking about it. And so Heather and I are both faculty at universities. We deal primarily with undergraduate students. And so you noticed on the previous slide, we had eco-anxiety. Well, our students have serious eco-anxiety, and they feel great responsibility. They feel some anger toward us, but they also, which is quite understandable, but they also are struggling with the question of just how large these problems are that we are facing, and how do we even begin to approach them? And that's not a question that has escaped us. This is something that we've been talking about for many years now. And so what Katharine Hayhoe says is keep talking about it, but find ways to talk about it. Find ways to communicate to people the science, find ways to communicate to people on the find ways to connect to your audience, know your audience, but also recognize that the scientific data are a very important part of this story. You cannot just overlook that or sugarcoat it. That has to be worked in, but there have to be other ways to get this across. And this is particularly true for when you're talking with policymakers as well. So if you would go to the next slide, so climate communication is a popular subject. You can look this up, you can do scholarly searches, and what you will find is that there are articles that are pouring into journals now about the way in which we should be communicating climate change and the way in which we should be changing the way that scientists typically talk about these problems. And so, for example, the IPCC has put out just a couple of years ago, really, it's I think about 3 years ago, the Principles for Effective Communication and Public Engagement. And you can see that, they have the things that you're taught in a basic communications course, right, as an undergraduate. But at the same time, what we have circled here, tell a human story, tell a human story. And so today, we're giving you examples of the way in which scientific data are merged with a human story as a way to improve engagement, as a way to enhance engagement, as a way to bring action. And of course, this all begins with our own experiences that we need to acknowledge that as we work in our communities, regardless of where we are working, these are photographs from Virginia's Eastern Shore. The fact is we are bearing witness. We are listening and bearing witness, and we are working with communities who are bearing witness. And so I often think about the fact that many of us have terminal degrees in anthropology, right? And we've had lots of courses in cultural anthropology, and we may have had some training in ethnographic work, but by and large, none of us was trained to deal with this kind of problem or to deal with the public in this way. Our careers, our discipline has been changing with greater public engagement now for several decades, but the fact of the matter is we are facing things that we were not prepared to deal with just in terms of the loss. So we are bearing witness to a particular kind of loss, but the people we are working with are bearing witness to a loss that is very impactful and is going to have a tremendous, going to bring about tremendous change in their lives. So just keeping that in mind. So what about archaeology? We have long said, as many of you know, we have sort of been challenged by the fact that as policies are developed, as funding is laid out and set aside, that archaeology is often left out. We're often not at the table. And yet at the same time, we recognize that not to say anything against our colleagues, but of all the disciplines, we should probably be at the head of the table, right? Because not only are we trained in understanding climate change, and we have looked at it over long periods of time and looked at how it has impacted societies, and we recognize the packages of information that are in these archaeological sites, but we also have been trained to understand the impact on communities. And so in terms of getting people to listen to archaeologists, getting people to recognize policymakers, educators to recognize the importance of archaeology for opening doors in this discussion of climate change. I think that some of us have been stymied, some of us have been frustrated. So our session at SAA was all about how do we talk about it? How do we get recognized? How do we bring together the work that we do with the immediacy? And so, Heather, I think this was one of your slides. I like it very much, but I would really like to hear what you think with this. You're muted.
Thank you. So I was just going to say, I was saying that as Carol mentioned earlier, this science telling, this narrative style of communicating things such as climate change is really pouring into through different avenues into, scholarly journals and things like that. And there are a number of different points that are made. And the one that I particularly liked is here, and this is put out by the American Association of Science, Center for Public Engagement in Science Technology, and they specifically call out the need to sort of like flip the way in which we as scientists communicate with the public. And so in that way, what we need to be really looking at is what people care about. What are they going to listen to? So our, typical style is quite, at least mine is, quite expository, a lot of background information. We go on and on. I mean, I find now that I'm, going back and examining some of the things that I write and things like and present at conferences, there's a lot of background. There's a lot of front loading of background and data. And that's great when we're talking to each other, because we need to do that in order to further science and further our sort of agenda in terms of talking about this type of research. But that isn't, according to this here, is not what's can connect with the public. So, in this model, they're saying flip it, and really just start with the bottom line, like a nice, concise, here's the problem, here's the issue, learn about the issue. And then so in lieu of, or, not necessarily in lieu of our supporting details, but sort of as a way to streamline and make our supporting details more concise, all that data, is to make it like into a so what, so here's the bottom line and here's why it's important. And then here's why we can say this, because this is the evidence that we've amassed through our research. And so, kind of start with the hook and end with all of that data that we're, really, connected to, that's really important for furthering our work.
Yeah, and to pick up on that, I think that we have to recognize that as archaeologists, we have been trained in scientific writing, and scientific writing buries the lead. No question about it. I think that we've gotten used to the notion that, well, we tell the story in the abstract, right? It's like, look at my abstract. And the fact of the matter is, people aren't going to read your abstract if you're trying to, depending upon the public you're trying to reach, or the folks, the communities you're trying to reach. And so I believe that in addition to some of the things that we're going to show you in the next few minutes, we also need to think hard about how we write, who we are writing for, and what our what the expectations are, and to kind of take control of it, to stop burying the lead.
Let's go on. Here we go. All right. Whoops. Here we go. So we'll just talk a little bit about some of the different approaches that not only us, but our colleagues, like I said, many of you here, are really being creative in trying to do this in a way that is impactful. So one way is through story maps. Several people in the session at the SAA were utilizing story maps as a way to develop a visual narrative. And so one example here is the one that I worked on with Sarah and a number of people that are on this Zoom today for the Society for Historical Archaeology, which is for Heritage at Risk Committee, which is this sort of like global approach here, just these really concise stories that are illustrated with some impactful visuals. And you can see our case studies here on this map. And so this is a great way to sort of start with that, bottom line. The bottom line right here, I think, is actually Meg's. Maybe I'm not sure if this is Meg's or Sarah's from their case study. That leading photo right there, that's with the Heritage at Risk. So this has been something that I think people have been attracted to, and has a good application. Some limits, though, I can see are, getting it out there. Like, how do we make people know where they find these story maps, and how do we get the story maps out to a broad public, not just to the Society for Historical Archaeology? And then with this particular one here, I think my personal feeling about its limitations is that it's really limited to the global north. And so as archaeologists, I think we also need to sort of extend our reach, not only to other communities, publics, but to other archaeologists working on this throughout the world.
Yeah, so, and this is another example of a story map. This is from Bandelier National Monument, Anastasia Stefan and others who were in our session. They created this largely to communicate to their colleagues. It was really interesting. The fire station folks got together and began thinking, brainstorming about the ways in which the different disciplines in their office, the way that the folks who are focused on fire, which, as you well know, is a huge issue. Massive fire burning around Flagstaff. Yes, Sarah says that was a great paper. But one of the things that they recognized is that it was possible and necessary to use scientific information, but to use it in a way, archaeological information, to use it in a way that was meaningful to their colleagues they're working with. So the fire scientists, the geomorphologists. And so again, thinking about who your community is, who exactly are you speaking to, and what is it that archaeology can bring to this discussion.
Oops, let's go on. All right, so we also have many colleagues. Sarah's one of them. Tom Dawson, who are using these videos, these short clips, and these actually longer videos. And some of these videos, their starring cast are the public themselves telling the story, which I think is great. To it's very sort of anthropological approach to have people telling these stories in their own words.
And you'll notice these are short clips. Yep. These are short clips. And so again, as we know from teaching, you can hold people's attention for so long, and then you have to think of something else. Okay. Yep. Another thing that many of you are very, very skilled at is citizen science. And I know that in a way, probably preaching to the choir here, so to speak. But what we have found, for example, in Virginia, is that our certification program that we have, which is quite extensive, has brought together people with very different backgrounds and very different levels of expertise, but all very interested. And so we look at them as partners, and they, in many ways, are some of our best press, I guess you could say our best press. They are the people who are out in their communities, who are telling people what they're doing. And we have just been, in the last month, we have been absolutely overwhelmed with the number of people. Just since SAA, we've had 10 more people sign up. And in large part working on sites that are going to be impacted or that have already been impacted. And so it's going out through that community. But one of the things that my students and I became very interested in is following in the footsteps of FPAN, following in the footsteps of Tom Dawson and SCAPE, was building an app so that people who are in communities, for example, this is from the Eastern Shore of Virginia, where the Chesapeake Bay is having quite a time. But folks who are not engaged in archaeological training, who are not committed to a citizen science program, but who have lived in these communities all their lives, are very important in helping us document what is there and what is being lost. So we have a very simple app called HERO, Heritage Resource Observers, and we have a bunch of people who are using it now. Only has 7 fields, and the data, we talked about this at SAA, but the data does go to the Department of Historic Resources in an unofficial layer that they can then share. And what we have found with this app is that in many places that are inaccessible by road, so, you know, unless you are an archaeologist who really knows these places, you're never going to get to these. These are, you have to go in boats to find these, to get to these sites in the coves and everything. And so it has just really opened up the discussion within communities. And of course, SCAPE and Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk app, which has just been the, I guess you could say, the pioneer in all of this, as well as, then our next slide, with FPAN. And so the Heritage Monitoring Scouts, which is a different approach, but the whole idea that the community is engaged, people who care about places, who care about heritage, are engaged with this work. And that as archaeologists, this is a hard thing to do. We find ways to give up a certain amount of control. We recognize that these are folks who are not going to do things exactly the way we would do them. We can give them forms, we can standardize as much as possible, and that's a good thing. But at the same time, recognizing that their approach to this and their interest in this is different from ours and their background. And so that's another technique that is being used in many different places. This is an example from FPAN, is the 3D terrestrial scanning and just creating models that you can take places so that people can understand what's happening, what was there, and what's happening to these resources. Very, very
And I thought that
impactful.
Sarah's presentation that included this was really awesome.
Yes, it was.
Because this is really, I think this is really a great form of narrative.
It is.
I mean, this is something people can, they can touch, they can understand, they can link with it, they can, you know, be attracted to it. I think it's great.
Yes. And the other thing to mention about all of this, getting it back to our topic of narration and science telling, is that we follow up with these folks. We follow up with the people who are working with us and do interviews with them. We try to get more stories from them as a way to fill out what the simple forms that the apps offer. And I think that one of the things that has happened, for example, in Scotland, this beautiful, beautiful initiative, Learning from Loss, Climate Stories, getting people to talk about how they feel about heritage, people in communities, what they're seeing being lost and why that's important, but also the way in which this is a catalyst for action and the way in which this is a catalyst for them to think about the way their world is changing. And so the multiple dimensions that come out of this storytelling approach or that grow from this are very important. Another thing that FPAN has really led in is this idea of community conversations. They're doing this in Scotland as well, but with the stories of loss. But simply this notion that the Science Collaborative grant program NEARS, and the whole idea that there are these wonderful community conversations and events that are taking place, these surveys that are happening in the different communities who are involved. And again, the whole idea is that finding out who your stakeholders are, but also going to them in a setting that makes sense, in a setting that will elicit this kind of work. And Sarah says there's one coming up in May. I saw that on your webpage. Yes, that's pretty cool. So maybe as we discuss this further, we can talk a little bit more about what this work entails.
So this
go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say one of the members of our session, Jen Rankin, is in Minnesota now. She trained in the Middle Atlantic, but she went back home to Minnesota. And Minnesota, just as with every other place, is seeing serious climate change impacts of a different sort than those who are out on the coast. But they have actually built into their agencies, they've built into their heritage agencies in Minnesota, programming around climate change that reaches out to the public. She gave some incredible examples of ways in which folks in communities are keeping their eye on things, but also how they're being brought more and more to the table to help plan.
Right, and this is from Mike Newland's work in California, working again with communities, and here they're going in after these devastating fires, and helping work with, like Carol mentioned, sort of this first responder role, working with communities to recover from their loss, recover physical items. Particularly, they're using dogs to help them locate cremains and recover them from these sort of devastating losses, and then tell the story, work with communities to tell the story, learn about the story, and then tell the story about what all this loss means for families and for communities.
And I also think it's important, if you go back to that slide for just a moment, these are traumatic events. When you imagine the idea of losing your home and everything that's in it, but also losing the ashes of a loved one, that adds to the trauma. And so with Mike and others who are working with them, this is not a well-funded project. This is a volunteer project in large part, where folks who actually have training in working with cadaver dogs, but also archaeology, have just decided this is what they're going to do. And I think we will be seeing more and more of this. I know that we all talk about how stressed we are with time and the demands that are on us, but I think one of the challenges that has come out of climate change for many of us is it has forced us to rethink our priorities. And so when we commit to this idea of working with the public and telling stories and listening, it will involve these kinds of events. And it will, as Mike will tell you, it takes a great deal to do this kind of work. And there's a lot of emotional weight that comes with doing this kind of work. But also going forward in California, we've been very interested to learn from Mike and others as well, the way in which the Chapeau has really turned the table on consultation. And not just the Chapeau, but of course, working in collaboration with tribal communities, so that as we talk about impacts, the narrative is not just around the site itself, it's about the broad context and the meaning of cultural heritage to tribal communities that is more than just one place. It's more than just this archaeological site, but rather the network, the connections between sites, the plants and animals, the water, the geography. As Mike said, when he reads reports now, he expunges the word exploit. Traditional peoples exploit, because that is not how they see it. That is not how they view their role within the environment as a whole. The division that we make between human and environment, of course, is not real. And so the idea that as we tell these climate narratives, we recognize that in many ways, the stories we started out to tell themselves are impoverished, and the stories really need to be expanded to look at these larger contexts. And then we have Marcy Rockman, and Marcy is with us today. We're so happy that Marcy is with us today, and I am hesitant to even begin to tell this because she, of course, has done more than just about anyone on this. But as you all know, some of you know, Marcy has led efforts in North America and in other parts of the world to get folks who are in power, in political power, to listen. And more importantly, to make decisions and to bring about action that will make a difference. And so she joined us in our sessions, in our session at SAA, and reminded us that when we are telling stories for policymakers, we have to figure out ways to use that narrative voice to draw them in ways that they can feel that they are participating. And part of it is telling the story with the science, but at the same time, recognizing that what they need to hear and what they are going to be energized to act on is the hope. And the question is not just what is the problem, what are we losing, but rather the and, the but. Even though this is happening and we are seeing the loss of this many sites or this percentage of coastal sites, however, but you can go forward. People in communities are recognizing what this means and they want to see action. Therefore, here is your suggestion. This is what we bring to the table. So it is this beautiful connection that both acknowledges the scientific work, but it acknowledges the needs of the community and it acknowledges the context of the policy maker. And I'm hoping that Marcy will also speak to this as well. So that brings us toward the end of our presentation. And Heather, why don't you start with this because it's a big day for us.
Yeah, so this kind of is a good segue from what Carol just mentioned in terms of Marcy's, push and approach to engaging policy. So our committee has worked really hard, did a great job. People really stepped up from this committee to produce a statement for the Society for American Archaeology on climate change and cultural heritage resources. We worked on it for several months, submitted it to the board. The board approved it. And as Carol mentioned, they have decided that today would be the release day. So they wanted to time it with Earth Day. So the statement will be circulated. It will go out today to members. And as Carol said, we'll see from there where it goes. But it's something that we hope is useful to archaeologists to take with them when they're talking to, for example, their politicians or educators, the whole K through 12, or, other archaeologists. And so we offered this statement, as we said, it's one of high priority for archaeologists, our community partners, the relevant agencies that we work with. And the whole premise of the statement, sort of the beginning part, the purpose of it, is to bring attention to the fact that climate change impacts correspond to our, as professionals, longstanding goal of understanding the complex relationship between humans and the environment, something that we're well positioned to do and uniquely positioned to do in many respects. Also, that the cultural resources have both scientific information, data, but also really important cultural value. And both of those aspects of cultural resources are being damaged and in some cases permanently destroyed by the impacts of climate change. And that we as archaeologists ourselves are changing in and will continue to change in really important ways as we carry out this work of, working with community partners and, as Carol said, bearing witness, and as Mike Newland pointed out, acting as first responders and those other types of roles.
And, it's interesting because, Marcy, we did not write it with the model you gave us in mind, but it really did kind of turn out to be an and, but, therefore kind of statement. And so one of the things that we were very, very focused on was making sure that this statement had action items in it. Many of you know that other organizations, other archaeological organizations, have written very powerful statements about the impact of climate change on heritage resources and why we need to be concerned. And we certainly used those we got some ideas from those, but we really wanted to use this to speak not only to the policymakers and to the communities, but to speak to our colleagues, because we felt that one of the things we need more than anything else is this shared vision, and we need some marching orders. And so archaeologists should, that's a big part of the statement, we should work to identify the types and magnitudes of threats. We should work to document, preserve, or mitigate. We should create prioritization models for cultural resources. So we're just kind of laying out the things that need to be done in order for us to move forward. But you'll notice that we are thinking also about the future. And so encouraging the development of curation and conservation policies, greatly needed, given the incredible amount of materials that are now being brought in, but also engaging in public outreach and work. So that is one of our major priorities here, communicating with other scientific, professional, policymaking stakeholder communities. And so continuing with this, I think we also had, Heather, what's our next slide? Yes, here we go. You want to talk about those? Because those are pretty
Sure.
cool.
Yeah, I want to go back for just a second. And so where we're talking about communicating, with stakeholder communities, and the one above it is also to educators, because, as Carol mentioned, we work with undergraduates, but, there's the whole K through 12 population, and they're coming up with that through this, really sophisticated understanding. We got to give, them credit, pretty sophisticated understanding of what the future may hold. And so this communication right here, that one last bullet point, is really the nexus of where our presentation was today, in terms of like, this is a form of communication that we should maybe, be considering as really important work for us, this narrative science telling. But also, as we mentioned in the sort of the premise part of this statement, is that archaeology is changing, our work as archaeologists is changing, our role is changing, and to keep up with that, archaeologists should, once again, as part of the action items, develop and deploy new methods, including ways to adapt our field work, different types of mitigation strategies, preservation work that might be, future oriented in terms of digital, preservation, and work to sort of lessen the impacts when possible to archaeological sites and the entire landscape, as we referenced with Mike Newland's work in California, his slide where he speaks to that.
Yeah, and the second one, unfortunately, this comes from our own experience, right? As archaeologists, we know there have been a number of times where emergencies have been declared, and one of the first points of discussion is, well, what kind of regulatory policies can we jettison, right? And so we've already started to hear this, that as we get more green initiatives, and we, looking at what may be coming down the pike if the bills ever get fully passed in Congress, but just being concerned that with these big initiatives for alternative energy, the development of wind, solar farms, and so forth, just making sure that Section 106 is protected, making sure that other regulatory policies which oversee the kind of work that we have come to rely on and that we've come to recognize is absolutely critical to protecting resources, that continues to flow in the United States, that it's not circumvented. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then, one of our final action items here is advocate for the resources that we need to help us do this work, to continue this work of prioritizing, documenting, mitigating adverse effects and things like that. So advocate for the funding, advocate for the legislation that will, enable us to do that work. So the SAA, as we mentioned, the board signed on, they approved this. They're partners in administering this statement. And so we also, in this statement, wrote in some roles that the SAA can have in terms of action items. So the SAA encourages us, we suggest that the SAA encourages us to produce a range of outcomes in addition to our, scholarly work in terms of article publications and so forth, but as well policy reports, other such types of public resources, including press releases, which, I think Meg would, agree is, another really important role that we should be taking on. The SAA should also encourage and allow the CSAR to collaborate with other committees, public education, curriculum committee, things like that, in order to infuse, climate change advocacy into the work that other organizations are doing.
Right. And I think that one of the reasons this statement was written to archaeologists is because we've come to recognize that we need support. We need to support each other. We need ideas. We need to, as I said earlier, marching orders, but more importantly, we need to be clear on how the work we are doing and the communities that we are working with are going to be changed by and will change. The discipline will change what we do, will change the archaeological record for the future. And so instead of writing a statement that said policymakers should do this and that or the other, our focus is on archaeologists. And we feel that the strength of this, we hope, will that this statement will provide a basis for our colleagues, folks who are working in communities and so forth, to come together. It will give us something to sort of hang our hat on. And so that's why it was written this way, and we are very grateful to the members of the committee for working on it with us. It's just been an incredible opportunity.
Yep, and several of them are here.
Yes, they are.
Yep. So
that's our story. That's our
Yep.
narrative story. That's our storytelling today.